Oklahoma, Korea, back to North Dakota, and eventually to this place we call Vietnam. In the beginning, we really didn't even know of Vietnam. It was called Indochina. Thanks to the French going there 80 years before we did, they had stolen the identity of the Laotians, the Cambodians, and the North and the South Vietnamese, and just called it Indochina. They had divided up into 5 different provinces, one being Cambodia, one being Laos, and 3 being in the 3 divisions of Vietnam. So essentially, in order to maintain the control, the French had went in and divided those countries and acted as though they were one. So when we thought about going in there, we had a real challenge. How were we going to start off with one thing and change it to something else? And it was probably 65 or so before you heard the word Vietnam. Most of the words you heard was Indochina. You know, I was in Grand Forks, North Dakota, when the call came down that we got need a replacement unit for an LBR unit that was in Southeast Asia. LBR stood for Local Base Rescue. But they had extended their responsibilities and changed it from LBR to rescue, just simple rescue. And our responsibility, our location was, quote, classified at the time. We know we couldn't put our APO and address where we were, but we ended up in Thailand, which is, and we were up in the northeast corner, essentially 7 miles from the Laotian border, which was considered the combat zone at that time. And our responsibility as American pilots were going into Vietnam for the purpose of slowing down supplies that were coming down from Russia, through China, through North Vietnam, and finally on the Ho Chi Minh Trail going into South Vietnam. So most of the heavy bombing early on was in the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and then we moved further north into Vietnam and started hitting some of the storage areas that equipment were in. And unfortunately, as we went on, to say some of the idiotic things we did as Americans, we sat there and watched them unload surface-to-air missiles in Haiphong Harbor, had pictures of it, and weren't allowed to shoot at it. We had to wait till they fired at us. Kind of the simply way we've been fighting the wars for a while now. They got to shoot first, and no matter how many you lose, you know, so they legally we could have probably destroyed every surface-to-air missile without a single shot ever being fired at an American airplane, but we lost hundreds of airplanes to surface-to-air missiles because we allowed them to build up their forces. Well, my job was to offer those guys a ride home if the airplane took hits, and once they got the ACAC and the surface-to-air missiles, there was quite a few airplanes being lost until we redeveloped tactics to minimize our losses. Unfortunately, it's nothing to say wrong, but you know, the mentality that was in charge of the war was we wanted to be small but promising, and we used tactics that were proven in World War II. But you know, here we are 25 years later, and those tactics weren't the best idea. And it took a while to get our leadership to recognize that we needed a better plan. I mean, we were still dive bombing when we had an airplane that could toss a bomb 25 miles, and we were losing airplanes over target. It's not a very smart thing. My job was a crew chief on a rescue helicopter. Like I said, we had redesignated from LBR to just rescue. We didn't have an airplane to do the job with, so we took the HH-43, which was just an LBR airplane, and turned it into a combat airplane. We put a piece of quarter-inch steel underneath the pilot and co-pilot seat, and we set on our World War II flak vest in the back. We didn't have the range we needed to do the job, so we had to create what was known as the first in-flight refueling for helicopters, and basically all it was a 55-gallon barrel, 2 quick disconnects, and a garden hose. But as we burned off fuel, then one of my responsibilities was to drain that fuel into the main tank and get more room in the back of the airplane to kick the barrel out. So the reality was I got a credit for a couple of bombing runs over North Vietnam with a 55-gallon barrel. We were on a 3-month rotation because everybody believed it was going to be a short war, and management was the best thing. You didn't want to get a bunch of people in. And of course, we'd always all remember the words of LBJ when he stood up and told the American people, "I'm not going to send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves." And so we felt it would, under those guidelines, that it would probably wouldn't go anywhere. So everybody wanted to do their part as quickly as possible, get a little medal on the chest, and run home and relish the war, you might say. Little did they realize that from 1965, we had 20,000 to 1968, President Johnson put over 600,000 troops in the field in Southeast Asia after making that statement to the American people. We were extended because the airplane that came in to replace us had mechanical problems, and we were extended for the duration. And after 6 months on station, we were called upon on the 20th of September to go out on a rescue mission, and that was the day to start my day, you might say, as a new life. We left our base, made it across into and located the pilot, and essentially we were going to have to do a horse pickup. A horse pickup is just a cable dropping down from the airplane. I have a 100-foot cable, and the last 10 feet are painted red, so that's how far we were above the ground, and I'm holding red cable as we go in to pick up the pilot. And as he gets into the sling, we get ready to lift him off the ground, we take small arms fire, and next thing you know, we're on the ground some 90 feet below, right next to it. We communicated with the pilot. We were trying to rescue. It informed us the place was infested, which we already knew that. That's the reason we were in a hurry, and we wanted to get out. But that wasn't going to be. The other airplane tried to swoop in to pick us up. Unfortunately, they started taking small arms fire, and they had to leave the area because they were had taken some internal hits, and some of the guys on board had been injured, and so they had to abandon us. To go back home to refuel and send in reinforcements. The rules of engagement were simple. We had to get as far away from the airplane as possible because basically within 30 minutes of the airplane hitting the ground, they would come in and blow it up, make sure that nothing on board fell in the enemy hands. And so we had to get far enough away to be safe in case not to be it had a stray bomb. And we made it probably a mile and a half away, evading through the Vietnamese, and eventually we realized that we weren't going to make headway during the day, so we found hiding, and we were sitting there waiting for darkness. Just before the darkness came, the Vietnamese started showing up, and the next thing you know, we were looking out through where we were hidden. We see anywhere from 100 to 150 Vietnamese, armed with everything from machine guns to machetes. And I can remember the words of the pilot that he looked at myself in Airman Black and said, "Live to fight another day." We could have probably took out 5 or 6 of them with our 6-shooter, but it would not have advanced the war in any way other than getting us killed. So it was the best interest at that point to surrender rather than get into a firefight with a 6-shooter. We were taken into captivity, and at first they were friendly towards us, and it wasn't like we could blend into the neighborhood. We were 100 pounds heavier and a foot taller than they were, so we were kind of a curiosity, you might say. At first they were kind, and then all of a sudden they blow into the blowhorn, and all of a sudden somebody's telling us who we are, and the next thing you know, they'll beat the hell out of us. And this was I guess you might say, a stage event for the next 2 or 3 days. And we went from village to village, being paraded around by the militia who had captured us. Probably the closest that I thought that my life was over, I was taken out one morning, my hands were tied behind me at my elbows and my wrist, and the rope was dangling down tied around my feet. And they kind of drugged me out and put me in front of a freshly dug hole. And I was convinced at that point that my life was over, that I was never going to see my 23rd birthday. As he read his proclamation, I was even more convinced. As I could look underneath the blindfold, I could raise my head back and see there was a crowd gathered, and I could see from the shadows, I could see 2 guards standing behind me with weapons pointed at me. And I was counting, you might say, my breaths as to where my life would end at this point. And sure enough, something was said, and the next thing you know, the 2 guards behind me lowered their weapons, and one on each shoulder lifted me up and took me back to the makeshift cell I was in. And from that point on, I don't know why, other than the good Lord's intervention, that I'm here today. But from that point, I realized that I was going to survive this situation. Didn't know how, didn't know what the future held, but I had been, in some ways, believing that I would live to fight another day. Eventually, I was turned over to the regular military, and with a no-nonsense, I spent the next 7 days traveling through North Vietnam by both truck, car, boat, walking, and eventually arrived in the city of Hanoi. When we got about a block of the Hanoi Hilton, they pulled our blindfold off so we could see the Hanoi Hilton, which was basically walls about 25 feet high with broken glass and concertina wire on the top. And I can remember the guard saying home, and we talk about now as we listen to the news, misinterpretation of words, and I was certainly thinking San Francisco, and I was not thinking the Hanoi Hilton as home. But eventually we were ushered through the front doors and separated, and I went back and I was ushered into a small cell that I could stretch my arms in any direction to touch the outside wall. As I sat there wondering what the next move was, the Vietnamese wore kind of sandals that sounded like flip-flops. You could hear them coming. And as soon as that sound had gotten out of the distance, a voice rang out, identifying himself as Colonel Robinson Reisner. And his first words to me was, "Be prepared to die for your country." And I was taken back. I said, you know, the hard part is not here yet. And sure enough, it wasn't. But he answered with another thought. He said, "If we survive, we must return with honor." Next thing I know, they opened a little peephole in the door. They shoved in a few items, a long shirt, a short shirt, long pair of pants, short pair of pants, much like pajamas with a drawstring, a bar of soap, a tube of toothpaste, toothbrush, a hand towel, a mosquito net, and a blanket. And as I looked at those items laying on my bed, little did I realize they would be my worldly possessions for the next 8 Thanksgivings, 8 Christmases, and 8 New Years that I would ring in captivity. The things that kept us going was the motto that many of us knew throughout our lifetime: you never give up, you never give in, you roll with the punches, you bounce back, you get ready for the next round. These are the things that helped us. The verbiage that helped us was the new shoot downs. When they come in, they were convinced we had them on the run, the war can't last 3 more months, we'll be out of here before Christmas. So that was kind of the motto, we'd be home before the end of the year. Probably the most devastating thing was in January '66, after our first few months, Robert McNamara took to the airways with the directions of Lyndon Baines Johnson and labeled the prisoners of war as expendable. You know, we kind of laughed, thinking, well, you know, that's pretty smart of him, you know. And but can you imagine how you would feel if your son, your husband, your brother, your father was labeled by essentially the number 2 man in America at that time as expendable. He clarified it with the words, well, we're just trying to get the pressure off of them so the Vietnamese will let them live a normal life, you might say, as we work the problem. And he encouraged our family to remain silent as they work the problem. But the real mission of LBJ and Robert McNamara was to get us off the front pages of the newspaper. And they exceeded without expectation. We were really relegated to the last pages of the newspaper, and eventually we didn't make the newspaper at all because it wasn't beneficial for them. Shortly after that, I moved out to the Briar Patch, and I lived in a small cell out there. We had no running water, no electricity, and we lived like that for a little over a year. And I never thought I'd say that running water and electricity is the mainstay of survival, you might say. Well, to accommodate themselves, they would feed us at daylight, and they would tie us up and leave us tied up until dark, and then they would untie us and feed us again. And this is kind of the conditions we lived in for several months. Eventually, due to failing health for most of us, even the youngest among us, that they eventually had to bring us back to, quote, civilization, and you might say, bring us back to health again. You know, we had a march in '66 where they took Americans and they pushed them down the streets of Hanoi, and next thing you know, it caused an outrage. And the Vietnamese promised the Americans that all those prisoners who asked for forgiveness would be allowed to return home when the war was ended. And so that set out a summer of heat, you might say, as we were brutally beaten, tortured for confessions of crimes we never committed. And eventually they got a confession of some sort out of all of us. Fortunate for us that, you know, they weren't worth the paper they were written on, and at that time the American press still had a little bit of integrity, and because they could not verify the sources, most of these letters were never printed. We came back, and of course the numbers had grown, and now they were forced to take us out of solitary confinement and put us into rooms with others. You see, we started out with most of us spending 6 to 8 months in solitary confinement, and some guys spent as much as 4 years in solitary confinement. You know, essentially described as we were cold in the winter, hot in the summer, and little to no health care available from the Vietnamese. They proudly said they fed us on a budget of 20 cents a day of our money. So basically, our mainstay, we ate 2 meals a day with the vegetable of the season, and I'm here to report that grass grows year-round in Vietnam. As we ate probably 100 to 115 different varieties of grass. We did have rice, and thankfully the French had been in and taught them how to make bread, and when we weren't bombing the bread factory, then we got bread. But every time that bread wasn't available, they said we had bombed a bread factory. So it was kind of we could just look up and say, I guess we just bombed the bread factory today and we were fed rice. Once they brought us back, we had high hopes because we started getting in larger rooms and more people, and we hoped that we were, I'm worried about stepping off the stool up here and it'd be a 4-inch drop, and I'll probably break a leg, but I'm gonna hang on to it. But you know, we lived what I would say under 4 faiths. Faith in ourselves, that we had the tools to get the job done. Faith in each other, that we would stand together and eventually return home with honor together. Faith in our country, that it would not abandon us in difficult circumstances, but most of all, faith in our God, that it would see us through. When we came back and got into larger groups and we were we were convinced that things were happening. We didn't know what was happening. And all of a sudden, President Johnson took to the airways and announced to the world that he had stopped the bombing of North Vietnam. And we were excited and we were confident we were on our way home. And as we slowly watched it unfold, the word expendable was loud and clear. For not once was anything mentioned in the peace conference about the prisoners of war. In fact, during the Johnson administration, not a POW family was invited to the White House. Not only when the bombing stopped and we weren't going home, it had taken away that new energy that we got each time a new guy would show up. There was no one there to come in into how's things going. You can't last 3 more months. We'll be out of here before Christmas. That had all gone away. We are essentially, no other way to describe it, but abandoned on the battlefield. President Nixon took office, and one of the first things he did was invite the POW families to the White House, or a representative thereof, and gave them a briefing as to what he knew at that particular time and assured them that we would no longer be forgotten. And it helped our families through those trying times as they felt like they had someone that cared. Now you think about, you couldn't relive that cutoff, but the way we found out that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon was on the back of a sugar pack, and I'm sure many of you are old enough, some of you may not be, but that used to on the restaurant table, there used to be little sugar packs on the backside of little bits of history. And that's how we found out that Neil Armstrong had walked on the moon from one of those little packs. Because through the efforts of President Nixon, some of the family members went to Paris to talk to the North Vietnamese, bringing awareness of our situation. We admittedly that the International Red Cross had tried to help, but because North Vietnamese, even though they had signed the Geneva Convention, refused to honor it, so the International Red Cross refused to send partials. American Red Cross did send partials to Vietnam, but unfortunately when they were found on dead North Vietnamese soldiers in South Vietnam, then they ceased the activity. So through the efforts of our families, they would convince the Vietnamese they could send us small packages, and eventually some of those packages reached us. Not everybody got a package, but they consisted of things like coffee, tea, bouillon cubes, bacon bits, things of that nature. And I can remember a friend of mine just sitting there holding a pack of Kool-Aid. You said, well, it's just a pack of Kool-Aid. But in reality, that was the first contact he had had with his family in over 5 years. Well, President Nixon set out to end the war. As the Vietnamese stood up, Americans went home. And eventually, our leaders went in to President Nixon and said, we have a small prison camp called Sante, much like the Bry Patch that I had been in, that we think we can get in there and get some prisoners out. And sure enough, on 20 November 1970, they attacked that compound, secured it, only to go in and find that there's no POWs there. They had been moved out a few days before. There was remnants of there. And those guys wept thinking what a failure they had been. But as a result of their action, the Vietnamese changed our label from expendable to high value. The Hanoi Hilton that we were using just a small portion of all of a sudden was cleaned out, a political prisoner and a female prisoner that was inside the compound, and made it into an American prison. And guys who had been in solitary confinement for 4 and 5 years walked into a room with 40 other guys. We had a new awakening of our life as a result of a few. They tried to designate their leaders, but our seniors stood up and said, no, I'm in charge. In some rooms they went 5 and 6 deep, dragging out the next senior ranking officer as the next one stood up. And eventually won a major victory. And as probably a result of that action, we were able to get health care for some of those in dire need that probably would not have survived another 2 years that we would spend in captivity. So it was a truly successful mission, even though it didn't accomplish exactly what he wanted. but in reality, it brought 40 guys probably home that would not have made it the next 2 years. You might say as a result of that, life changed from hell to a livable hell. Someone asked me one time, said, could you give me a shorter version of POW life? And I said, yeah, there's a simple one. Hours, days, weeks, months, and yes, even years of boredom punctuated by terror. Every day we got up with a new hope. It seemed like all of a sudden there were new shoot downs. When we got a kind of hold of them, we asked them how the war's going. They come out with, can't last 3 more months, we'll be out of here before Christmas. Seemed like we heard that story before, so we said, well, what do the cars look like? And they responded, well, they haven't changed much since last year. Of course, we're still 5 years behind at this point. And so we asked them, so how about fashion? They said, well, skirts were up, but they headed back down. So they just created another worry in the prison camp that skirts would be back down to the ankles before we got home. But eventually, President Nixon had solved all the issues. He had reached an honorable end with the Vietnamese. There was only one thing left: negotiation of the release of the prisoners of war. The Vietnamese said, oh, you just go in the house, we'll take care of that later. But President Nixon was well aware there were prisoners in North Vietnam that were French that had been captured in 1954, and they were not released until 1979. He, nor the American public, would allow the war to stop and leave us behind. As a result of that action, the Vietnamese stormed out in the meeting. President Nixon unleashed what was referred to as line back at 2 and 11-day period, starting on the 18th of December 1972. We dropped more bombs than have ever been dropped in the history of mankind. Not to advance the war, but to secure the freedoms some 500 plus Americans we had held in captivity in North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Yes, we lost 40 brave men that wanted to bring their brothers home. In many ways, when I look at the wall, their names are etched in our minds. The first guy to die that night was Walter Ferguson. He was scheduled to go back and retire from the Air Force in 2 months. But he had the opportunity to go home, and he chose not to. He said, I want to bring my brothers home. And the first voice we heard was one of his crew members. When you asked them what they were doing, they said, we come to take you home. As a result of that action, the Vietnamese came back to the table and signed an agreement. And 12th of February 1973, some 45 years ago, we were homeward bound. Yes, freedom had finally arrived. A friend of mine was asked, could you identify freedom? And he simply said, doors with inside knobs. I'd like for you to just think about that. How your life would have changed today if the first door you went up to didn't have a doorknob on it, where you would be at this point. I came home to a welcome that probably belongs to some of you here in this audience. For I know that my brothers and sisters were brought home in the middle of the night. And I can't imagine after honorably serving their country in a combat zone and seeing hours, days, and weeks of combat, they were told to remove their uniforms so as not to offend anyone. So the welcome home I had allowed me to wear my uniform across this great land. Yes, as I look back, I always say one of the saddest moments to me is when we forgave those who ran before we said thank you to those who served. I'd like to remind something you'll never see in the newspaper. Yes, we sent a few cowards to Canada, but Canada sent us 5 times as many brave soldiers that stood by Americans, died with Americans, helping defend our way of life. In terms of losses, 300,000 injured, over 58,000 dead, over 1,500 still missing in action. We're comforting with that number in the fact that it was 3,400 when the war ended, but we have been able to find remains, and we still have just dipped under 1,600, so we're just a little over 1,500 now, still unaccounted for. But they joined the some 83,000 other Americans just Monday that we remembered who made the ultimate sacrifice for this land. You might say luck was on my side. Only 1 out of 5 aircrew members survived that were shot down over Southeast Asia. So I can truly say I'm one of the luckiest men alive. Yes, we won every battle, but we couldn't win the war. When you have people like Walter Cronkite, who was well represented at that time, when he stood up and said that at the Tet Offensive, after we killed, wounded, and captured nearly 45,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, and we lost 100 brave men, he referred to that as a defeat for America. Unfortunately, as a nation, we were never able to separate at that time the war from the warrior. So if in your mind the war was bad, the warrior was bad. And that carried on. In the early 90s, when we were called upon again to go assist our friends in the world, our soldiers were again belittled by the same people, the Fondas, the Kennedys, and the Kerrys, as they took to the airways. But it was a Vietnam veteran who stood up and said, hell no, not again. As a result of that action, America has renewed its commitment to our men and women in uniform as they stand wherever they have to defend us in our way of life. Yes, they are American heroes today. In closing, I share with you the words of a friend of mine who had passed on many years ago. He said, during my years of captivity, one idea has dominated my thinking. How fortunate I am to be an American. I have seen the other side. I have had every real and imaginative fault of the United States of America pointed out to me time and time again by my captors. But I have returned with a strong conviction, although we are far from perfect, our system